You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 5,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. The coffee in this diner tastes like burnt motor oil, but it's hot and it keeps me awake. That's all that matters anymore. I'm sitting in a cracked vinyl booth outside Bakersfield, California, watching the sun bleed orange through windows that haven't been cleaned in decades. The waitress refilled my cup 20 minutes ago and hasn't come back. She's standing behind the counter, staring at nothing, her mouth moving like she's trying to remember how to speak. She can't hear me when I tap my spoon against the cup. None of them can anymore. My name is Calder Rourke, and I used to fix things for a living. Broken air conditioners in strip malls where half the stores sell nothing but dust and broken dreams. Busted generators in warehouses that smell like rust and the ghosts of better times. Electrical panels in buildings that should have been condemned before I was born. It was honest work, and it kept me moving, always moving. But 15 years ago, I had a different job. One that required polygraph tests administered by people whose names weren't in any government database. One that demanded psychiatric evaluations that probed deeper than any human mind should be examined, conducted by doctors who asked questions about dreams I'd never told anyone. One that paid a salary that could have bought me a house in Beverly Hills, but cost me my marriage, my sleep, and eventually my soul. I worked for a Department of Defense branch that didn't exist on any organizational chart, housed in a facility that appeared on no satellite imagery or geological survey. We called it the Cellar, though that wasn't its official designation. Some analyst with a sick sense of humour started using the name during the construction phase, and it stuck because it perfectly described what we were building. Humanity's cellar, where we stored the things we couldn't explain, couldn't destroy, and couldn't allow the world to know existed. The cellar wasn't constructed to develop new weapon systems or conduct experiments on unwilling human subjects. It existed for one singular, terrifying purpose: to contain entities that violated every natural law we thought we understood. Things that crawled out of holes in reality itself, bringing their own twisted physics and incomprehensible purposes with them. I was a senior containment engineer, level 7 clearance, specializing in what the files called reality-adjacent phenomena. My job was designing prisons for nightmares, creating failsafes for when those prisons inevitably failed, and developing emergency protocols for situations that emergency protocols weren't supposed to cover. I specialized in the impossible cases, entities that laughed at conventional physics and treated our most advanced security measures like polite suggestions. The facility stretched deep underground in the Nevada desert, a reverse skyscraper descending into absolute darkness. 67 levels, each one more secure and more isolated than the last. The deeper you went, the stranger things became, until you reached zones where the laws of physics were more like loose guidelines. Levels 1 through 20 housed standard military equipment and personnel, the people who thought they were working for a conventional Black Ops program. Levels 21 through 40 contained entities that were merely dangerous, things that could kill you in straightforward ways, if you weren't careful. But below level 40, we kept the things that were dangerous to reality itself. Entities that could unravel the fabric of existence just by existing incorrectly. I worked primarily on level 52 in the high security containment wing, alongside some of the brightest and most psychologically damaged minds in the scientific community. Dr. Eleanor Grimm served as our lead researcher, a woman who could stare into cosmic horror without blinking, but needed 3 different prescription medications to sleep through the night. Tech specialist Finn Holloway maintained our electronic systems and spoke to computers with more fluency than he managed with humans. Security Chief Holden Meyer kept us all alive through a combination of military precision and barely controlled paranoia that served him well in a place where suspicion was a survival skill. During my 8-year tenure, we housed 93 active entities, each assigned an archive number based on the order of acquisition. The numbering system was Dr. Grimm's idea. She insisted that giving them names would make us too attached to our subjects, while numeric designations maintained proper scientific objectivity. Archive 3 was a living shadow that consumed photons and left perfect darkness in its wake, requiring a containment chamber lined with mirrors that trapped it in an infinite loop of its own reflection. Archive 17 was a Victorian-era music box that played melodies which drove listeners to perform increasingly violent acts of self-mutilation, kept in a soundproof vault that had to be evacuated every time it was opened for study. Archive 23 was simply a door frame, mahogany with brass hinges, nothing more, that opened to different locations depending on who walked through it and what they were thinking about at the moment of passage. We'd lost 2 researchers to Archive 23 before implementing a policy that required all personnel to undergo meditation training before approaching it. Archive 31 was a Victorian mirror that showed your reflection aging in real time until you died of accelerated cellular decay within minutes of making eye contact with your own image. Archive 45 was a teddy bear that transformed anyone who held it into a perfect physical replica of whoever had previously owned it, complete with memories and personality. Archive 58 was a staircase that descended infinitely downward, defying all architectural logic and spatial geometry. 3 separate research teams had attempted to map its extent, equipped with enough supplies for weeks of exploration. None of them ever returned, though we occasionally received radio transmissions from impossible depths, consisting mainly of screaming and fragmented reports about the things that climb up from below. But Archive 12 was different from all the others. Archive 12 was the Hushborn, and it didn't just violate natural laws, it rewrote them entirely. The recovery operation began in October 1987, triggered by a report from the Nye County Sheriff's Department about a potential biological warfare incident in Cedar Flats, Nevada. Population 847 according to the Weather Beaten Welcome sign, a former mining town that had somehow managed to survive the economic collapse that had claimed most of its neighbours. Every single resident had vanished without a trace. Not dead, vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of mass evacuation or natural disaster. Kitchen tables still held plates of food that hadn't had time to spoil. Cars sat in driveways with engines still warm. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on sidewalks where they'd been dropped mid-ride. The local sheriff had called it in as a suspected chemical leak or terrorist attack, but when the CDC hazmat teams arrived, their instruments detected nothing. No toxins, no radiation, no biological agents, no traces of conventional weapons, just an oppressive silence so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against your eardrums. The CDC team's initial report described the town as acoustically anomalous. Background noise that should have been present, wind through leaves, distant traffic, the hum of electrical systems, was completely absent. Even their own equipment operated silently within the town limits. That's when Director Morrison activated the Cellar's emergency response protocols and dispatched a full recovery team. The entity was discovered 3 days later in the town's Methodist church, standing motionless at the altar like a grotesque scarecrow. It measured exactly 7 feet in height, humanoid in basic structure, but wrong in ways that made experienced soldiers physically ill just to observe. Its entire form was wrapped in layers of animal hides that had been crudely stitched together with what appeared to be sinew and lengths of barbed wire. Deer pelts formed the outermost layer, their empty eye sockets creating a patchwork of hollow stairs that seemed to follow observers around the room. Beneath that, rabbit fur created a matted grey underlayer that moved slightly despite the absence of any air current. Foxtails hung from its arms like macabre tassels, while what appeared to be bear hide covered its torso, complete with claw marks that might have been decorative or might have been warnings carved by previous victims. The stitching was elaborate and ritualistic, suggesting either artistic intent or obsessive-compulsive behaviour. Its head was wrapped in a smooth expanse of pale leather that analysis would later confirm was human skin, carefully preserved and treated with unknown chemicals. The face had no features except two perfectly round holes where eyes should have been, holes that went deep, so impossibly deep that our strongest flashlights couldn't illuminate their bottom. When you stared into them, you got the disturbing impression that something vast and patient was staring back from an infinite distance. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't its appearance. It was what happened to sound in its presence. Within a radius of exactly 30 feet from the Hushborn's position, all audio simply ceased to exist. Not muffled or dampened, completely absent, as if the concept of sound had been surgically removed from local reality. When the recovery team approached the church, their footsteps became silent. Their radios stopped transmitting. Their heartbeats made no sound. Even the involuntary sounds of human biology, breathing, swallowing, the rustle of clothing, were absorbed into absolute quiet. The team's mission recorder captured the exact moment of first contact. You can hear their voices, their equipment, the crunch of broken glass under military boots. Then, at times tamp 14 hours, 23 minutes and 7 seconds, complete silence for 7 minutes and 38 seconds. When audio returns, it's just heavy breathing and whispered profanity as grown men tried to process an experience that violated their fundamental understanding of how reality worked. Team leader Sergeant Martinez was the first to speak when they'd retreated beyond the entity's influence. His voice was shaky, professional composure, barely intact. "Base, this is Recovery Team Alpha. We have visual contact with the anomaly. Repeat, visual contact confirmed. We're going to need the special containment protocols for this one. All of them." Standard containment methods failed immediately and catastrophically. Physical barriers meant nothing to the Hushborn. It seemed to exist partially outside our dimensional framework, slipping through solid matter when unobserved like water flowing around stones. Electromagnetic fields had no effect. Gravity manipulation chambers couldn't establish a lock on its position. Even our most advanced temporal displacement units treated it as if it simply wasn't there. The entity appeared to follow only one rule. It remained stationary during direct observation but would relocate when no one was watching, always appearing in the most acoustically active area of whatever space contained it. If you looked away for even a moment, it would be somewhere else when you looked back. Dr. Grimm theorized that the Hushborn was drawn to sound the way plants are drawn to sunlight, not for nourishment but for some incomprehensible purpose that required the presence of audio to fulfill. Her initial behavioral reports noted that it would orient itself toward whatever was making the most noise in its vicinity, though it never moved while being observed. After 6 weeks of failed containment attempts, Director Morrison called me in for an emergency consultation. I was working on Archive 47 at the time, a telephone that connected to random numbers throughout history when dialed, but the Hushborn took priority over everything else. "Rourke," Morrison said during our briefing in his Level 1 office, "I need you to design something that's never been designed before. A containment system for an entity that doesn't follow the rules we use to contain everything else." I spent 3 months developing Archive 12's containment protocol, working with a budget that could have funded a small war and access to technologies that officially didn't exist. The solution required abandoning everything we thought we knew about physics and starting from first principles. I designed an anechoic chamber unlike anything that had ever been constructed. The containment unit wasn't just soundproof, it was designed to eliminate the fundamental quantum vibrations that allowed sound to exist in the first place. The chamber measured exactly 60 feet in each dimension, suspended in the center of a spherical cavity carved from solid bedrock 300 feet underground. The walls were constructed from 17 different layers of materials, each one designed to disrupt a different aspect of audio transmission. Steel plates sandwiched between polymer meshes that scrambled electromagnetic fields. Concrete mixed with powdered quartz to interfere with dimensional phasing. Lead shielding to block radiation we couldn't measure but knew was present. Layers of specialized foam that absorbed not just sound waves but the quantum fluctuations that created the possibility of sound. The entire chamber was suspended by gyroscopic stabilizers that could compensate for seismic activity up to magnitude 9.0, with backup systems that would activate automatically if the primary supports failed. Access was provided through a single elevator shaft with 19 separate security checkpoints, each one requiring different clearance levels and biometric confirmations. The shaft itself could be sealed with explosive charges in case of containment breach, trapping anything inside for geological ages. Emergency protocols included the option to flood the entire lower section with liquid nitrogen, concrete or molten steel, depending on the nature of the breach. The only opening in the chamber was a single observation window made of transparent aluminum, 8 inches thick, triple sealed with airlocks that could be flooded with various gases or energy fields if necessary. Even that window was considered a potential security risk, but direct observation was required to prevent the entity from relocating. Audio monitoring was impossible inside the chamber. Sound simply couldn't exist in that environment. We could only observe through high-resolution cameras, equipped with thermal imaging, electromagnetic spectrum analysis, and sensors that detected energy patterns we didn't have names for. Installation took 6 months and required rotating crews of specialists who could only work in the chamber for limited periods. Prolonged exposure to the acoustic void caused severe psychological effects in construction personnel. Depression, anxiety, and a condition Dr. Grimm termed auditory phantom syndrome, where workers would hear sounds that weren't there. During the construction phase, the Hushborn was temporarily housed in a reinforced holding cell on level 45, under constant observation by teams of researchers working in 4-hour shifts. The entity never showed aggression or apparent awareness of its surroundings, but its presence was psychologically exhausting. After an 8-hour shift observing it, staff members would be unable to tolerate even normal conversation volumes for days. I found myself volunteering for observation duty more frequently than protocol recommended. There was something hypnotic about the Hushborn's absolute stillness, the way it stood perfectly motionless, except for the almost imperceptible turning of its head to track whoever was watching. Those black eye holes seemed to peer directly into your thoughts, reading intentions you didn't know you had. Dr. Grimm warned me about spending too much time with individual entities. She'd developed extensive documentation about what she called psychological contamination, the gradual alteration of a researcher's mental state that occurred after prolonged exposure to certain anomalies. Some of these things don't just affect the physical world, Calder, she explained during one of our weekly evaluation sessions. They change the people who study them. Slowly, subtly, but permanently. The human mind wasn't designed to process certain types of information, and exposure to entities like Archive 12 can rewrite fundamental aspects of personality and cognition. I dismissed her concerns as academic paranoia. Every job had occupational hazards, and ours just happened to involve risking your sanity instead of your physical safety. Besides, someone had to monitor the entities during construction, and I was the most qualified person available. The transfer to permanent containment took place on March 15th, 1988, at 0300 hours. The entire operation was conducted in complete silence. No verbal communication, no electronic devices, no sounds of any kind that might interfere with the process. Staff communicated through hand signals and written notes, moving with deliberate precision through procedures we'd rehearsed dozens of times. The Hushborn walked docilely into its new prison, guided by researchers wearing specialized suits that created a buffer zone between them and the entity's sound-dampening field. Once the chamber was sealed and all personnel evacuated, the Hushborn took its position in the exact center of the room and resumed the patient vigil it had maintained for months. For 12 years, Archive 12 remained perfectly contained. The entity stood motionless in its chamber like a monument to human ingenuity and determination. We published carefully edited papers on advanced acoustic technology that revolutionized audio engineering across multiple industries. The Cellar received increased funding and expanded operations to 3 additional underground facilities. Politicians praised our success in containing threats to national security. Everything was perfect. I should have known it wouldn't last. The first signs of trouble were subtle and easy to rationalize. During my final 2 years at the Cellar, I began experiencing increasingly vivid nightmares where I wandered through empty cities wrapped in animal hides, leaving silence in my wake. I would wake up with my throat raw, as if I'd been screaming without making any sound for hours. The dreams were always the same. I would find myself standing in the center of a town square, surrounded by people who were trying to communicate but couldn't produce any sound. Their mouths would move frantically, their faces showing increasing panic as they realized their voices were gone. Children would try to cry for their parents, but no sound would emerge. Car horns would be pressed, but remain silent. Even falling objects would hit the ground without making any noise. In the dreams, I was both observer and cause. I could see the terror in people's faces as they realized what was happening, but I was also the source of their silence. The animal hides I wore in the dreams felt familiar, comfortable, like clothing I'd been wearing my entire life. Dr. Grimm documented these experiences in my mandatory psychological evaluation reports, noting them as potential symptoms of what she'd begun calling entity attachment disorder. Her theory was that certain anomalous objects or beings could form psychic bonds with individuals who spent extended periods studying them. The human mind creates neural pathways based on repeated experiences, she explained during one particularly intensive evaluation session. When those experiences involve entities that operate outside normal reality, the pathways themselves can become altered, changed in ways that reflect the entity's nature rather than normal human psychology. She recommended reducing my observation duties and rotating me to a different archive, but Director Morrison overruled her assessment. My expertise with Archive 12's containment system made me irreplaceable, he argued. No one else understood the chamber's complex failsafes and emergency protocols well enough to maintain proper security. Looking back, I think Morrison was afraid of what might happen if they moved me away from the Hushborn. Not afraid for my safety, but afraid that the entity might react negatively to losing its most dedicated observer. My personal life disintegrated gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice until it was too late to salvage. My marriage to Rebecca collapsed in 1995, 7 years after Archive 12's successful containment. She said I'd become a different person, that living with me was like sharing a house with someone who was only pretending to be human. "You don't talk anymore, Calder," she said during our final argument. "When you do speak, It's like you're reading from a script. You go through the motions of being my husband, but there's nothing behind it. It's like the person I married has been replaced by someone who learned how to impersonate him. She was right, though I couldn't admit it at the time. Conversations had become exhausting. The effort required to produce words, to modulate my voice into appropriate emotional tones, to maintain the social facade that normal human interaction demanded. It was overwhelming. I found myself speaking only when absolutely necessary, preferring written communication or simple gestures. My free time was spent in increasingly isolated activities. I soundproofed my home office and spent hours sitting in perfect silence, finding the absence of noise more relaxing than any music or television program. I sold my stereo system, disconnected the telephone, and removed the batteries from every device that might produce unexpected sounds. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday. I remember because I was scheduled for observation duty that day, and I spent my 8-hour shift staring at the Hushborn through reinforced glass, wondering if it understood what loneliness meant. Those black eye holes seemed more attentive than usual, as if the entity could sense the change in my emotional state. By 1999, I was living alone in a studio apartment with soundproof walls I'd installed myself. My furniture consisted of a bed, a desk, and a television I never turned on. I owned exactly 7 books, all technical manuals related to acoustic engineering and containment protocols. I ate the same meal every day, a sandwich and a cup of black coffee, because making decisions about food required more mental energy than I could spare. My social interactions were limited to necessary work communications and brief exchanges with store clerks. I developed an elaborate system of gestures and written notes to minimize the need for verbal communication. Most people assumed I had a throat condition and were polite enough not to ask questions. Dr. Grimm retired in 2000, citing accumulated stress and health concerns related to prolonged exposure to anomalous entities. Her replacement, Dr. Marcus Webb, was a behavioral psychologist who focused on quantifiable data rather than theoretical speculation. He dismissed Grimm's theories about entity attachment as unprofessional pseudoscience and removed her research from the official archives. I requested a transfer to a different archive that same year, hoping that distance from the Hushborn might help restore some semblance of normal psychological function. Director Morrison denied the application immediately, stating that my expertise with Archive 12's containment system made me irreplaceable for security reasons. "You designed that chamber, Rourke," he said during our brief meeting in his office. "You understand its failsafes better than anyone else on the team. We can't risk rotating you out when containment security depends on your specialized knowledge." What he didn't say, but what I suspected, was that they were afraid of how the Hushborn might react to losing its primary observer. For 12 years, I'd spent more time watching the entity than anyone else. If Dr. Grimm's theories about psychological bonding were correct, my removal might destabilize the containment in unpredictable ways. The years blurred together after that. Archive 12 remained perfectly contained, standing motionless in its chamber like a patient monument to our success. I continued my observation duties, 8 hours per day, 5 days per week, for 15 years total, watching and being watched in return through reinforced glass and across impossible distances. During those final years, I began to understand something that Dr. Grimm had only theorized about. The Hushborn wasn't just contained by our chamber, it was tolerating containment. The entity existed partially outside our dimensional framework and could leave any time it chose. The question wasn't whether it could escape, but why it was choosing to remain imprisoned. The answer came to me gradually, through careful observation of subtle behavioral changes that occurred over months and years. The entity wasn't passive or dormant. It was waiting, not for rescue or freedom, but for the right moment to complete some incomprehensible purpose that required patience measured in decades, and that purpose involved the people who had spent the most time studying it. I left the Cellar in March 2000, exactly 12 years after Archive 12's initial containment. The official reason was the early retirement due to accumulated stress leave and psychological evaluation recommendations. The real reason was that I could no longer sleep in the same state as the facility. Even 60 miles away from the underground complex, I could feel those black eye holes watching me through layers of rock and steel. Using my substantial retirement payout, I bought a used RV and started travelling across the country, picking up repair work wherever I could find it. Electrical systems, HVAC units, industrial equipment, anything that kept me moving and provided enough income for basic necessities. Constant movement helped. If I stayed in one place for more than a few days, the silence would begin to feel oppressive, like a weight pressing against my consciousness. The nightmares would return with increased intensity, and I'd start seeing glimpses of stitched animal hides in reflective surfaces. For 3 years, I managed to convince myself that I'd escaped. The psychological symptoms gradually faded. My voice returned to normal volume and tone. I could tolerate background noise again, even found myself enjoying music while I worked. The nightmares became infrequent and less vivid. I thought I was recovering. I thought I was free. I was wrong about everything. The earthquake that changed my life forever occurred at 3:47 a.m. Pacific Time on April 12th, 2003. I was replacing a furnace in a diner outside Topeka, Kansas, when the breaking news interrupted the morning talk show. A 6.2 magnitude earthquake had struck the Nevada desert, centered in what the reporter described as an uninhabited region near the California border. The moment they announced the coordinates, my blood turned to ice water. I recognized those numbers. They marked the exact location of the Cellar's primary facility. The news coverage was strangely minimal and deliberately vague. No casualties reported because the affected area was uninhabited. No structural damage assessments because there were no significant buildings in the affected zone. No geological analysis because it was being classified as naturally occurring seismic activity that required no special investigation. Every single statement was a carefully constructed lie. The Cellar housed over 300 personnel on any given day, working in shifts around the clock. The facility itself was a marvel of underground engineering, designed to withstand seismic events up to magnitude 8.0. And the Nevada desert was one of the most geologically stable regions in North America. Significant earthquakes were virtually impossible there, without artificial cause. I spent the rest of that day trying to contact former colleagues, using emergency numbers I'd memorized years earlier but hoped never to use. Dr. Grimm's personal phone went straight to a generic voicemail system that didn't even mention her name. Finn Holloway's number had been disconnected with no forwarding information. Security Chief Holden Meyer's line rang endlessly without going to voicemail, which was impossible, given the sophisticated communication systems the Cellar maintained. The news blackout began within hours of the initial reports. No follow-up coverage about the earthquake zone. No rescue operations mentioned on any network. No geological surveys or scientific assessments. No government officials making statements about investigating the incident. It was like that patch of Nevada desert had been surgically removed from public awareness, forgotten by every news organization and government agency simultaneously. But I started noticing other things, small anomalies that seemed to follow me from town to town like invisible shadows. At a truck stop outside Kansas City, I witnessed an entire restaurant full of people eating lunch in complete silence. Their mouths moved as if they were engaging in normal conversation, but no sound emerged from anyone's lips. Silverware clicked against plates, but the sound would cut out mid-clink. Coffee percolated in glass pots, but the familiar gurgling was absent. The entire scene lasted maybe 45 seconds before normal audio returned, and none of the patrons seemed to notice anything unusual had occurred. When I asked my waitress about it, she looked at me with genuine confusion and insisted that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. According to her, the restaurant had been operating normally all day, with typical levels of customer conversation and ambient noise. In a mechanic's garage in Springfield, Missouri, I watched a technician using a pneumatic impact wrench that spun at full speed without making any noise. The tool was clearly functioning. I could see bolts being loosened and removed, but the characteristic high-pitched whine was completely absent. When I mentioned this to the mechanic, he looked at me like I was suffering from heat stroke and insisted his equipment had been working normally all morning. At a motel in Little Rock, Arkansas, the air conditioning unit in my room would cycle on and off without its usual mechanical hum. I could feel cold air blowing from the vents, see the unit's exterior fan spinning, but hear absolutely nothing. I complained to the front desk about the broken AC, but when the maintenance worker checked it 20 minutes later, everything sounded completely normal. These incidents followed me everywhere I went, always brief, but growing more frequent with each passing week. I started keeping a detailed journal, documenting every occurrence with precise timestamps, locations, and duration. The silent zones were expanding in both geographic scope and temporal duration. After 3 weeks of escalating incidents, I broke my personal rule about avoiding anything connected to my former employment and used my old security clearance to access the Cellar's personnel database through a military terminal at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. What I found in those classified files made my hands shake so badly I could barely type the necessary commands. The facility's operational status was listed as decommissioned, catastrophic, structural failure. All personnel records had been changed to transferred, classified locations, with no additional details provided. Every single archive entry, all 93 contained entities, had been redesignated as relocated, destination unknown. But buried deep in the archived research files, in documents that somehow hadn't been purged from the system, I found Dr. Grimm's private theories about Archive 12. The classified research she'd conducted in secret, the psychological profiles she'd developed without authorization, the behavioral analyses she'd never shared with the review board. According to her hidden research, the Hushborn wasn't actually contained by our sophisticated chamber. It was tolerating containment for its own incomprehensible purposes. She believed the entity existed partially outside our dimensional framework and possessed the ability to leave its prison any time it chose. The sophisticated barriers we constructed weren't keeping it trapped. They were simply providing a controlled environment where it could observe its observers without interference. Her theory was terrifying in its elegant simplicity. The Hushborn was waiting, not for rescue or freedom, but for the optimal moment to reclaim what it considered its rightful property. And that property consisted of the human beings who had spent the most time studying its nature and behavior. She'd documented a phenomenon she called psychic marking, a gradual bonding process that occurred between certain anomalous entities and their long-term observers. The entity would slowly alter the observer's psychological makeup over months or years, preparing them for an eventual reunion that would complete some purpose beyond human comprehension. According to her research, the marking process was irreversible once it reached advanced stages. The affected individual would begin experiencing dreams and visions related to the entity's nature, develop preferences that aligned with the entity's characteristics, and gradually lose interest in normal human activities and relationships. I had exhibited every single symptom on her detailed checklist. During my 15 years at the Cellar, I'd spent more time observing Archive 12 than any other team member. During the containment chamber's construction phase, I'd worked alone with the entity for hundreds of hours across 6 months. If Dr. Grimm's theories were correct, I wasn't just a former employee trying to escape his past. I was Archive 12's designated target, psychologically prepared and ready for collection. The phone call that confirmed my worst fears came exactly 1 week after I'd accessed the classified files. I was staying in a roadside motel outside Memphis, Tennessee, trying to decide whether to keep running or find somewhere to make a final stand, when my cell phone rang at 11:43 p.m. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. Halden Myers' personal emergency line, a secure communication system that should have been deactivated years ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I answered. "Halden? Jesus Christ, where have you been? I've been trying to reach everyone since I heard about the earthquake. What happened to the cellar? Are you all right?" Complete silence, not the empty hiss of a bad connection or the subtle static of long-distance transmission. True silence, the kind that exists in vacuum chambers and sensory deprivation tanks. Silence so pure and absolute, it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums with measurable weight. But I could sense someone on the other end of the connection. Movement that created no disturbance. Breathing that produced no sound. The unmistakable electrical presence of another consciousness sharing the line, waiting with patience that felt familiar and terrifying. I stayed on that call for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, counting each one while my pulse hammered in my throat and sweat soaked through my shirt. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of intention, heavy with purpose I was afraid to understand. When the call ended, with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud, in the sudden return of ambient noise, I immediately tried calling back. The number was disconnected with no forwarding information or automated message. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the motel room window watching the empty parking lot, feeling like prey being stalked by something I couldn't see but knew was circling closer. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. Every small sound made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted and paranoid, but I'd made a crucial decision. I needed to find out what had really happened to my former colleagues. The internet searches I conducted over the following days painted a picture that was even more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Halden Myers' obituary was buried in the back pages of a Henderson, Nevada newspaper, minimally detailed and strangely impersonal for someone with his military record and community standing. Security consultant Halden Gregory Meyer, age 52, found deceased in his locked apartment on April 18th. Cause of death listed as animal attack of unknown origin. Mr. Meyer's throat had been torn out with what the coroner described as surgical precision, using an unidentified implement. There were no signs of forced entry or theft. Building security cameras malfunctioned for exactly 20 minutes during the estimated time of death. Neighbours reported hearing no sounds of struggle or distress. The funeral had been held with military honours, but the guest list was classified and no media coverage was permitted. I'd missed it entirely, and even if I'd known about it, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to attend. Dr. Eleanor Grimm's death record was equally disturbing, though it had been classified as an accident rather than homicide. Single vehicle collision on Highway 95, approximately 2 weeks after the Nevada earthquake. Her car had left the road at high speed and struck a massive oak tree head-on, with impact force sufficient to kill her instantly. But the details made no sense. No skid marks indicated any attempt to brake or steer away from the obstacle. The highway was straight and empty, with perfect visibility and no weather-related hazards. Toxicology reports showed no alcohol, drugs, or medical conditions that might have impaired her driving. Most disturbing of all, the coroner noted that she'd been conscious and alert when the impact occurred. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel when they extracted her body. Her seatbelt was properly fastened, but her foot wasn't on the brake pedal. It was as if she'd deliberately driven into the tree at full speed. Tech specialist Finn Holloway's death was officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances defied everything I knew about his personality and psychological profile. He was found in his soundproofed home studio, having apparently suffocated himself by securing a plastic bag around his neck with duct tape. But Finn suffered from severe claustrophobia that bordered on pathological. He couldn't even ride in elevators without experiencing panic attacks. The idea that he would choose suffocation as a method of ending his life was psychologically impossible. He would have selected pills, a gunshot, anything that didn't involve the sensation of being trapped or unable to breathe. The police report mentioned no suicide note, no recent signs of depression, and no financial or personal problems that might have motivated self-harm. His studio equipment was still running when they found him, as if he'd been working on a project right up until the moment he died. I was the last one left, the final member of the Archive 12 containment team still breathing. The silent zones around me were no longer brief interruptions. In normal acoustic environments, they lasted for minutes at a time and seemed to be expanding in both geographic range and temporal intensity. I watched a gas station where every pump operated without mechanical noise while customers filled their tanks and conducted business inside the convenience store without speaking a single audible word. Their mouths moved in conversation patterns, but no sound emerged from anyone present. At a roadside restaurant in Oklahoma, I observed an entire dining room full of families eating breakfast without the familiar sounds of silverware against plates, coffee being poured, or children talking to their parents. They seemed completely unaware that their world had gone mute for 43 minutes before normal audio gradually returned. My own speech was becoming increasingly unreliable. Individual words would disappear from my sentences, leaving gaps that made communication nearly impossible. Then entire phrases would become soundless, my mouth moving through familiar motions, while my vocal cords produced no vibration whatsoever. I could feel the air passing over my tongue and teeth, sense the muscle movements required for speech, but hear nothing. I bought a small notebook and started writing instead of speaking whenever possible. Most people assumed I had a throat condition or was recovering from surgery and were polite enough not to ask uncomfortable questions, but I could see the unease in their eyes when they watched me mouth words that produced no sound, the way they'd unconsciously step back as if silence might be contagious. The entity was preparing me for something. The only question was whether I'd keep running until it was ready to complete whatever process had been set in motion 15 years ago, or make a stand on my own terms while I still retained enough humanity to fight back. I chose to fight. The opportunity came through a job posting on a contractor website that I'd been monitoring for weeks. An abandoned textile factory in Millfield, California. Population 847, exactly the same number as Cedar Flats where the Hushborn had first been discovered. Needed comprehensive electrical system repairs before conversion to artist studios and retail spaces. The building had been empty for 30 years and was scheduled for renovation starting in 2 months. The location was perfect for my needs, isolated, structurally sound, and large enough to accommodate the kind of preparations I had in mind. I drove to Millfield on a Thursday afternoon in late September, taking back roads to avoid highway cameras and staying in cash-only motels to minimize electronic records of my movements. The town was exactly what I'd expected. Small, quiet, and forgotten by the rest of the world. The kind of place where strangers were noticed but not necessarily unwelcome, especially if they had money to spend. I met with the property owner, Patricia Chen, at a coffee shop on Main Street that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. She was a pleasant, businesslike woman in her 40s who'd inherited the factory from her grandfather, was finally trying to turn it into something profitable. The electrical system hasn't been touched since 1973, she explained, sliding a folder of architectural drawings across the scarred wooden table. We need everything brought up to current code before we can get occupancy permits. The city inspector said it's going to be a complete rebuild. New panels, new wiring, new everything. I examined the blueprints while sipping coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. The factory was a massive brick structure from the 1940s, originally built to produce canvas and rope for the military during World War II. High ceilings, solid construction, and most importantly for my purposes, completely isolated from the nearest occupied buildings. I'll need at least 3 weeks to assess the existing systems and develop a comprehensive repair plan, I told her, writing the words in my notebook since my voice had become completely unreliable by then. Full access to all areas, including basement levels and utility spaces. Patricia agreed to pay half my quoted fee up front and gave me the keys without asking too many questions about my inability to speak. By Friday evening, I was alone in 50,000 square feet of empty factory floor, with all the privacy I needed to prepare for what was coming. I spent the weekend converting that warehouse into the most elaborate trap I could design. My plan was based on a theory I'd developed during my years observing Archive 12. The Hushborn created its silence through localized fields that dampened acoustic vibrations within a specific radius. If I could overwhelm those fields with multiple overlapping sources of sound operating on different frequencies and wavelengths, I might be able to confuse or disable the entity long enough to destroy it with conventional weapons. I started with the building's existing PA system, which had been used to coordinate work shifts during the factory's operational years. I installed industrial-grade speakers in every corner of the building and connected them to backup power sources I'd purchased from a military surplus dealer. Each speaker was programmed to emit different frequencies of white noise, creating a cacophony that would theoretically be impossible for any single dampening field to neutralize completely. Next came the mechanical noisemakers. I hung chains and metal pipes from the ceiling on hair trigger releases, positioned to clang and crash when disturbed by movement or vibration. Industrial alarm bells mounted on motion sensors throughout the building. Compressed air horns connected to timer circuits that would activate randomly every few minutes. I rigged the factory floor with sheets of corrugated metal that would buckle and bang when stepped on. Installed wind chimes made from steel pipe and rebar that would create discordant tones in even the slightest air current. Set up a dozen different radio receivers, tuned to static-filled frequencies, each one broadcasting through separate amplification systems. In the basement levels, I placed automatic hammers that would strike metal plates at irregular intervals. Pneumatic devices that would release bursts of compressed air into resonating chambers. Even modified car alarms that would cycle through their full range of sounds continuously. The idea was to create layers upon layers of sound, each one independent and redundant. If the Hushborn silenced one source, 23 others would still be generating noise. If it dampened an entire section of the building, other sections would remain acoustically active. I was betting that even an entity that could absorb sound would have limits to its ability, but I knew sound alone might not be enough to stop something that had been contained for 15 years and then somehow escaped from a facility designed to hold it forever. So I spent my second week rigging the building with enough explosives to level a city block. Plastic explosive charges on every major support beam and load-bearing column. Incendiary devices near the electrical panels and fuel storage areas. Thermite charges positioned to bring down specific sections of the ceiling in a controlled collapse. White phosphorus grenades that would burn through steel and concrete, all connected to a single detonation system I could trigger from a handheld remote with a range of half a mile. If my sound trap failed to disable the entity, I would bring the entire building down on both of us. 50,000 tons of brick, steel, and concrete dropping simultaneously would either destroy the Hushborn or bury it so deeply that it would never surface again. I'd included enough incendiary material to ensure that whatever remained would burn, at temperatures hot enough to melt iron. The personal stakes were higher than simple survival. During my preparation work, I began experiencing memories that weren't my own. Visions of walking through empty towns wrapped in layers of animal hides, watching families disappear one by one as silence spread like a plague through their communities. I could remember the texture of stitched fur against skin I'd never worn, the sensation of looking through eye holes that went infinitely deep into spaces that shouldn't exist. Most disturbing of all, I could remember the satisfaction of completing my purpose, the sense of fulfillment that came from bringing perfect quiet to a world that had forgotten how to appreciate silence. Dr. Grimm's research notes had mentioned psychological contamination, but she'd vastly underestimated the extent of the entity's influence. The Hushborn hadn't just formed a psychic bond with me during those 15 years of observation. It had been slowly rewriting my fundamental psychology, preparing me to become a suitable host for whatever cosmic purpose it served. The nightmares were getting worse and more frequent. I would dream of standing in the center of silent towns, watching people try to scream warnings that no one could hear. In the dreams, I was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, the person trying to warn others and the entity that had stolen their voices forever. I started avoiding reflective surfaces because sometimes my reflection would show stitched animal hides instead of my normal clothes. Sometimes those infinite black eye holes would overlay my own eyes, staring back with patient malevolence from depths that violated every law of physics and geometry. The entity was coming for me, but in a very real sense it was already here. The question was which version of myself would survive the encounter, the human being who'd spent his career containing nightmares, or the thing that nightmare had been preparing me to become. Wednesday night, I made my final preparations. I double-checked all the audio equipment, tested the explosive charges with the electronic multimeters, verified that my backup power systems were fully charged and functioning properly. Every system was ready and operational. I positioned myself in the center of the factory floor, sitting in a folding chair I'd placed exactly equidistant from all the major sound sources. Around me, 27 different noise generators created a symphony of industrial chaos that was almost physically painful to endure. The building hummed and clanged and shrieked like a mechanical beast in its death throes. At exactly 11:47 p.m, every sound in the warehouse died simultaneously. Not gradually, not system by system, not with the sputtering failure of mechanical breakdown. Every speaker, every alarm, every pneumatic device, every radio receiver stopped producing audio at precisely the same moment. It was like someone had pressed the cosmic mute button and silenced the entire universe with surgical precision. The sudden absence of sound was more shocking than the loudest explosion. My ears rang with phantom noise, trying to process a silence so complete that it felt like being buried alive. The Hushborn stood 30 feet away, exactly where I'd expected it to appear. 7 feet of patient malevolence wrapped in layers of stitched hide that seemed more elaborate than I remembered. Among the deer and rabbit skins that had always covered its form, I could now see patches that looked disturbingly human. Pale leather that had been carefully preserved and treated, sewn into the existing patchwork with meticulous attention to detail. Fresh additions to its collection, it moved toward me with that same jerky, marionette gait I remembered from hundreds of hours of observation, but there was something different about its coordination now. It moved more fluidly, more purposefully, as if freedom from containment had improved its motor functions. Those infinite black eye holes tracked my movement with predatory focus that made my skin crawl. I triggered the explosive charges when it was 20 feet away, pressing the detonation button with enough force to crack the plastic casing. Nothing happened. The remote was completely dead in my hand. Not malfunctioned, not damaged, simply inert, as if the very concept of explosive force couldn't exist in the entity's presence. I pressed the button repeatedly, checked the battery indicator, even tried the backup frequency, but got no response from any of the charges I'd spent days installing. The Hushborn had absorbed more than just sound. It was dampening the electromagnetic fields that powered my equipment, interfering with the chemical reactions that should have triggered my explosives, perhaps even suppressing the physical laws that allowed rapid combustion to occur. It reached me before I could stand up from the chair. Fingers like frozen bone wrapped around my left arm, and I felt my radius and ulna snap under pressure that shouldn't have been possible for something that appeared to weigh no more than a human being. The pain was excruciating, but my scream of agony made no sound at all. The sensation of screaming without audio was somehow worse than the broken bones. The entity lifted me effortlessly and held me at eye level, studying my face with something that might have been recognition or satisfaction. Up close I could see the individual stitches that held its hide covering together. Some were made with sinew that looked fresh, others with wire that had begun to rust, a few with what appeared to be human hair braided into strong cord. I found myself staring directly into those infinite black holes, and instead of the emptiness I'd expected, I saw my own reflection. Not my face, but my entire body wrapped in the same kind of stitched animal pelts, standing motionless in the center of an empty room that looked exactly like Archive 12's containment chamber. The vision lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours of perfect clarity. When my normal sight returned, the Hushborn was gone. I was alone in the warehouse, sitting in my chair with my broken arm hanging useless at my side and the taste of copper filling my mouth. But something fundamental had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in the rhythm of my heartbeat, in the way air moved through my lungs. The transformation Dr. Grimm had theorized about was finally complete. The silence persisted for another 27 minutes before the first sounds began to return. A distant car engine on the highway. Wind through broken windows high above. The slow drip of water from a leaky pipe in the corner of the building. But when I tried to call for help, no sound emerged from my throat. When I tried to stand, my legs moved with coordination that felt foreign, yet familiar. When I looked down at my clothes, I saw patches of animal hide that flickered in and out of visibility, like a television with poor reception. I spent 14 hours in the emergency room at Kern Medical Center in Bakersfield, getting my arm set and casted while doctors ran tests to determine why I couldn't speak. They found no physical damage to my vocal cords, no neurological abnormalities, no medical explanation for my condition. Sometimes severe trauma can cause temporary psychological mutism, the attending physician explained to me in writing, since I couldn't respond verbally to his questions. It should resolve itself within a few days as your system processes what happened. If not, we can refer you to a specialist. I let them believe their diagnosis because the alternative was too complicated and too dangerous to explain. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than anything in their medical textbooks. The Hushborn hadn't attacked me in that warehouse. It had completed a process that had been ongoing for 15 years, a gradual transformation that had reached its final stage. The explosion I'd planned hadn't destroyed the entity. It had provided the energy needed for our permanent fusion. I checked myself out of the hospital before dawn and drove to a truck stop with public restrooms. In the harsh fluorescent lighting above the sink, I stared at myself in the mirror and watched my reflection flicker between human and something else entirely. Sometimes I looked normal, tired and battered, with my left arm in a cast, but recognizably human. Other times I saw layers of stitched hide covering my body, black holes where my eyes should be, a featureless face wrapped in carefully preserved human skin. The visions were becoming more frequent and lasting longer. I understood what had happened in that warehouse, what had been happening to me for 15 years, without my knowledge or consent. I was no longer Calder Rourke, former containment engineer. I was Archive 12, walking free in a world with no facility to contain me and no team to monitor my activities. The entity hadn't escaped from the cellar. It had been released, along with all the other archived entities, as part of some larger plan that I was only beginning to understand. I left California that morning and started driving east, following a route that seemed to choose itself. My broken arm healed with unnatural speed, the cast becoming loose within days, instead of the weeks the doctors had predicted. My voice never returned, but I found I didn't miss it. Speaking required interacting with other people, and that was becoming increasingly difficult and unnecessary. The silence follows me everywhere now. Not just the absence of my own voice, but the gradual dampening of the world's audio, wherever I go. I'll walk into a restaurant and watch conversations die mid-sentence as patrons forget how to produce sound. I'll pass a construction site and see jackhammers operating without noise. Dogs try to bark at me but produce nothing but silent movement of their jaws. The effect spreads outward from my location like ripples on a pond, creating expanding zones of acoustic dampening that persist long after I've moved on. Behind me, I leave communities where children play without laughter, where car engines run in perfect quiet, where even the wind forgets how to make sound as it moves through the trees. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my true nature in reflective surfaces, store windows, car mirrors, puddles of water after rain. The stitched hides are always there now, overlaying my human appearance, like a double exposure. The black eye holes occasionally replace my normal vision, showing me the world as the Hushborn sees it, empty of sound, full of potential. I've been walking for 6 months now, moving from town to town across the American heartland. The silence spreads wherever I go, creating permanent changes in the acoustic properties of entire communities. I'm not sure if I absorbed the entity, or if it absorbed me. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. We are one organism now, carrying out a purpose I'm beginning to understand with crystal clarity. The Cellar wasn't designed to contain entities like the Hushborn. It was designed to prepare them, to study their capabilities, understand their needs, monitor their development, and eventually release them into the world when they were ready to fulfill their true function. People like Dr. Grimm and Director Morrison weren't researchers and containment specialists working to protect humanity from anomalous threats. They were incubators, carefully nurturing entities from beyond normal reality until they were ready for deployment against a world that had grown too loud, too chaotic, too filled with meaningless noise. The earthquake wasn't a natural disaster or containment failure. It was a planned release, timed to coincide with the completion of our psychological preparation. Every entity in that facility is now walking free, carrying out missions they were bred and trained and modified to accomplish over decades of careful observation and study. Archive 3, the shadow that consumed light, is probably moving through major cities right now, bringing darkness to places that have forgotten what real night looks like. Archive 17, the music box that drove people to self-harm, is likely spreading its influence through the music industry, subtly altering songs to include frequencies that rewrite human behavior. Archive 23, the doorway that opened to different places, might be creating transportation networks for the others, allowing instant travel between locations thousands of miles apart. Archive 31, the aging mirror, could be positioned in hospitals or nursing homes, accelerating natural death processes to reduce overpopulation. We are all weapons in a war that humanity doesn't even know is being fought against them. A war to restore the natural order that existed before humans developed language, before they filled the world with mechanical noise, before they forgot that silence is the default state of the universe. I thought I was the keeper of monsters, but I was wrong about everything. I was just another weapon, waiting to be activated, another tool being prepared for deployment in a conflict that began long before human civilization and will continue long after it ends. Right now, I'm approaching a town called Haven Springs. Population 1,847. It's a farming community in central Kansas, the kind of place where Everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed but not necessarily unwelcome. They have a church bell that rings every morning at sunrise, calling the faithful to early prayer. Children play in streets lined with maple trees that are just beginning to turn colours for autumn. Dogs bark warnings at passing cars, and the sound carries clearly in the crisp October air. They have no idea what's walking toward them down Highway 36. By tomorrow morning, Haven Springs will be the quietest place on earth. The church bell will ring once, maybe twice, before the sound dies forever. The children will open their mouths to laugh and play, but only silence will emerge. The dogs will try to bark warnings that no one will hear, and the wind will stop making noise as it moves through those maple leaves. And I'll keep walking, carrying the Hushborn's gift to the next community, and the next, spreading perfect silence across the world, like a benediction. Behind me, I'll leave towns full of people who remember what sound used to be like but can no longer produce it themselves, who go through the motions of normal life without the acoustic feedback that makes human interaction meaningful. Sometimes I wonder if this was always humanity's destiny, to create the tools of their own transformation and mistake them for protection, to build facilities like the Cellar and convince themselves they were containing threats instead of cultivating them, to spend decades studying entities from beyond reality without realizing they were being studied in return. The footsteps behind me make no sound at all, but I know they're there. Sometimes I turn around expecting to see other figures, wrapped in stitched hides, other graduates of the Cellar's hidden curriculum, but there's never anyone visible, just the sensation of being accompanied by something that shares my purpose and understands the necessity of what we're doing. Haven Springs is 3 miles ahead now. I can see the grain elevators rising above the surrounding farmland, the water tower with the town name painted in faded blue letters, the cluster of houses and businesses that constitute the entire community. Smoke rises from chimneys in perfectly straight lines. There's no wind today, which seems appropriate. The air is still and expectant, like the world is holding its breath. From this distance, I can hear the town before I can see it clearly. The distant hum of human activity, cars rumbling down Main Street, lawnmowers cutting the last grass of the season, the sound of children playing in backyards behind white picket fences, all the acoustic pollution that humans mistake for life. All of it will stop soon. I've learned to read the signs that precede my arrival in a new place. The silence doesn't announce itself dramatically with supernatural fanfare. It seeps in gradually, like fog rolling over a landscape, or disease spreading through a population. First, the ambient background noise becomes slightly muffled. Birds sing a little quieter. Wind through leaves creates softer rustling. Car engines seem more distant, even when they're directly beside you. Then, specific sounds start disappearing for brief moments. A dog's bark cuts out mid-woof. A phone rings 3 times instead of 4. Conversations pause as individual words vanish from sentences, leaving speakers confused about what they were trying to say. Music from radios becomes intermittent, cutting in and out like a station with poor reception. By the time people notice something's fundamentally wrong, it's too late. The silence has already taken root in their vocal cords, their instruments, their machines, their very understanding of what sound means. Within hours, an entire community becomes a population of mimes, performing their lives without the acoustic backdrop that gives human activity, meaning, and context. I've done this 23 times now. 23 towns across 9 states, each one carefully selected for maximum isolation and minimum outside contact. Small communities where strangers are rare and people trust their neighbours. Places where a few days of communication breakdown won't immediately attract federal attention or media coverage. The process is always the same, following patterns I understand instinctively now. I walk into town looking like any other drifter seeking temporary work. I find somewhere to stay, a motel, a boarding house, sometimes just camping behind an abandoned building or in a public park. Then I wait for the entity's influence to spread through the local environment like an infection moving through a host organism. Within 48 hours, the transformation is complete. Every person in town loses their ability to produce sound. Every mechanical device operates silently. Even natural phenomena, wind, rain, flowing water, the rustle of leaves, become muted in the affected area. But the people don't panic, and that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what I've become capable of. They adapt to their new reality with supernatural calm, as if the absence of sound is perfectly natural and expected. They develop hand signals, write notes to each other, continue their daily routines without seeming distressed by the fundamental change in their existence. I think the Hushborn's influence extends far beyond simple acoustic dampening. It affects the parts of the human brain that process auditory information, making the absence of sound feel normal and appropriate. The residents of silenced towns don't miss their voices because they can't remember what voices were for, can't conceptualize the idea that communication through sound was ever possible. I never stay to watch the complete transformation. Once the silence has established itself permanently, I move on to the next destination on a route that seems to plan itself. But I've driven back through some of the earlier towns, checking on their progress and documenting the long-term effects of what I've done to them. Millbrook, Ohio was my fourth target. When I returned 8 weeks later, it looked like a movie set between takes. People went through the motions of their lives, without sound. Cars driving silently down Main Street, children playing voiceless games in the park, shopkeepers serving customers who communicated only through gestures and facial expressions. The town was perfectly preserved, but fundamentally hollow. Like a music box with its mechanism removed, going through familiar motions without the melody that gave them meaning and emotional resonance. Cedar Falls, Iowa showed even more advanced symptoms when I revisited it 3 months after my initial visit. The residents had stopped trying to communicate entirely. They moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, each person isolated in their own bubble of perfect silence. The town still functioned. Shops opened, mail was delivered, streetlights turned on at dusk, but it felt completely abandoned, even with people walking the streets and working at their jobs. I realized I wasn't just stealing sound from these places. I was stealing something much deeper and more fundamental. The essential human quality that makes communication possible. The urge to reach out to others and share experiences through language and sound. Each town I silence becomes a little more perfect, a little closer to the ideal state that exists in my dreams. A world where humanity exists in pure isolation, each person wrapped in their own cocoon of perfect quiet, freed from the chaos and meaninglessness of constant noise. But Haven Springs will be different. Not because I'm changing my methods or approach, but because I'm beginning to understand the full scope of my true purpose. The memories that aren't my own have been getting clearer and more detailed with each town I transform. I can recall centuries of wandering through a world where sound was rare and precious. I remember standing in forests where no birds sang, walking through cities where footsteps echoed without noise, watching civilizations develop elaborate visual languages because their voices had been taken away permanently. This isn't the first time the Hushborn has walked among humans. It's done this before, in previous centuries, previous millennia. Each cycle lasts roughly 1,000 years, enough time for humanity to forget the last period of silence, to rebuild their noisy civilization, to become complacent about their ability to make sound and fill the world with meaningless acoustic pollution. Then the entity returns, either through natural manifestation or through facilities like the Cellar that think they're containing threats when they're actually incubating them for future deployment. It finds a suitable host, merges with them completely, and begins the process of returning the world to its natural state of perfect silence. I'm not the first person to carry this burden across the landscape. Throughout history, there have been others like me, individuals who thought they were studying anomalous entities but were actually being prepared for transformation into something beyond human understanding. Researchers and scholars and containment specialists who spent too much time observing things that were observing them in return. The ancient Romans had stories about the silent plague that swept through Gaul in 847 AD, turning entire provinces mute overnight and leaving behind empty cities where people moved like ghosts through their daily routines. Medieval chronicles describe the quiet death that claimed half of England in 1347, leaving survivors unable to speak or produce any sound for the rest of their shortened lives. The Great Silence of 1692 depopulated most of colonial New England, creating ghost towns that remained uninhabited for decades because even animals avoided areas where sound had been permanently removed from the environment. Each time, authorities blamed disease or supernatural curses or divine punishment for humanity's sins. They never understood that they were witnessing a natural cycle, as inevitable as the changing of seasons or the movement of tides across the ocean floor. Humanity's time of noise is ending. The age of silence is beginning again, and I am its herald. I can see Haven Springs clearly now, nestled between rolling hills, covered in winter wheat that waves soundlessly in a breeze that makes no noise. Smoke rises from chimneys in perfectly straight lines because the air is still and expectant. The town looks exactly like all the others I visited, small and isolated and trusting, the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and children ride bicycles without helmets. Perfect conditions for what's about to happen. As I walk down Highway 36 toward the town limits, I can hear Haven Springs before I reach it. The distant hum of afternoon activity, cars, voices, machinery, all the acoustic pollution that humans mistake for life and vitality. In a few hours, all of that will be nothing but memory. A pickup truck passes me heading toward town, and the driver waves through his window, a friendly gesture from someone who has no idea he just greeted the end of everything he knows about communication and human interaction. I wave back with my good arm, the one that finished healing, weeks ahead of the doctor's schedule. The town limit sign reads Haven Springs, population 1,847. Founded 1923, home of the Fighting Eagles. Below that, someone has added a hand-painted banner advertising the annual corn festival scheduled for next month. They're planning for a future that won't include sound, making preparations for celebrations that will be conducted in perfect silence. I pass the first houses on the outskirts of town. A woman is hanging laundry in her backyard, humming a tune I can't identify, while her washing machine runs loudly in the background, an old model that chugs and vibrates with each cycle. By tomorrow, both her humming and her laundry will be completed in absolute quiet. Children are playing in a front yard 3 houses down. 2 boys and a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, taking turns on a tire swing hanging from an oak tree whose leaves are just beginning to turn red and gold. They're laughing and shouting to each other, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Higher! Push me higher!" the girl calls out as she swings back and forth, her blonde hair streaming behind her like a banner. She'll never make another sound for the rest of her life. I continue walking towards the center of town, my footsteps creating the last noise these streets will hear for a very long time. Behind me, I can sense the boundary of silence expanding outward like ripples on a pond, moving at the speed of sound itself. The woman stops humming without realizing why. Her washing machine completes its cycle without the usual final spin and mechanical click. The children's laughter dies in their throats, though they continue playing as if nothing has changed. By the time I reach Main Street, the transformation has begun in earnest. Cars drive past without engine noise. Shop doors open and close without bells ringing. People walk on sidewalks with footsteps that make no sound, conduct business in stores without the background hum of air conditioning or fluorescent lights. But they don't seem to notice anything unusual. They continue their conversations through gestures and facial expressions, as if they'd always communicated that way. The entity's influence has already begun rewriting their expectations and memories about how the world should work. I find a diner called Mabel's Kitchen and push through the front door. The bell above the entrance swings but produces no chime. Inside, a dozen customers sit at tables and booths, eating their afternoon meals in perfect silence. Forks don't clink against plates. Coffee doesn't gurgle as it pours from glass pots. Even the sizzle of food cooking on the grill behind the counter has been muted. The waitress approaches with a smile and gestures towards an empty booth by the window. She's a woman in her 50s with grey hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind eyes that suggest she's worked here for decades, probably knows every customer by name and their usual orders. She hands me a menu and points to the daily specials written on a chalkboard behind the counter. I order by pointing to a picture of a cheeseburger and fries. She nods and walks back to the kitchen, moving through her familiar routine with practiced efficiency. Through the pass-through window, I can see the cook flipping patties and adding cheese, going through motions he's performed thousands of times, but which now happen in complete silence. Through the window beside my booth, I watch Haven Springs continue its normal afternoon activities without sound. A mail truck drives slowly down Main Street, stopping at each business to deliver packages and letters. Children ride bicycles on the sidewalk, their wheels spinning silently on concrete. An elderly man walks his dog past the hardware store, both of them moving through a world that has lost its voice but doesn't realize what's missing. None of them understand what's happening because they can't remember what sound was like before it stopped existing. To them, this is simply how the world has always been. The Hushborn's influence doesn't just remove audio. It removes the memory of audio, the expectation that sound should exist at all. My burger arrives 15 minutes later, delivered by the same waitress who continues to smile despite being unable to speak. I eat slowly, savouring what might be my last meal as a recognisably human being. The food has no taste, but I'm not sure if that's because of the Hushborn's influence on my sensory perception, or because I've lost interest in flavours that don't contribute to my primary purpose. As I eat, I watch the street outside and think about the families in those houses. Parents trying to call their children for dinner without voices. Kids attempting to sing songs they can no longer remember the words to. Teenagers discovering that their music has become silent vibrations that convey no meaning or emotional content. But they won't be distressed by these losses because they won't remember having them in the first place. The entity is merciful in that way. It takes away both the thing and the knowledge that the thing ever existed, preventing the psychological trauma that would result from understanding what they've lost. After finishing my meal, I leave a $20 bill on the table and walk back outside into the silent autumn afternoon. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seem louder than any sound ever was. Colour becomes more vivid when sound disappears, as if the absence of one sense enhances all the others to compensate. I walk through Haven Springs as darkness falls, past houses where families gather around dinner tables in perfect silence. Through windows, I can see people watching television shows without audio, reading books to children who can't hear the stories, playing board games that require no conversation or verbal interaction. The transformation is nearly complete. In a few more hours, Haven Springs will join the growing network of silent communities spreading across the American heartland like a beneficial infection. 23 down. Hundreds more to go before my work is finished. I find a small park in the centre of town and sit on a bench beneath a street light that hums silently with electrical current. Around me, the night sounds that should exist. Crickets, owls, distant traffic, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush have all been absorbed into the expanding sphere of silence that follows wherever I go. But I'm not alone. In the shadows between streetlights, I can sense others like me. Not visible to normal perception, but present nonetheless. Other carriers of the Hushborn's gift. Other former researchers who thought they were studying anomalous entities when they were actually being prepared for transformation into weapons of cosmic restoration. Dr. Grimm is out there somewhere, walking through a different part of the country, spreading silence to communities that don't yet know they're about to lose their voices forever. Her psychological expertise makes her particularly effective at targeting places where people gather to talk. Universities, conference centres, political rallies. Finn Holloway moves through urban centres, his technical background allowing him to silence entire city blocks at once by targeting the electronic infrastructure that modern communication depends on. He's probably working his way through major metropolitan areas, systematically eliminating radio stations, television broadcasts, internet servers. Even Halden Meyer, despite his official death, continues his security duties by ensuring that no one interferes with our mission. His military training makes him ideal for handling government responses to our activities, eliminating federal agents or researchers who get too close to understanding what's really happening. We are the Cellar's final graduates, released into the world to complete the education we began in those underground chambers. Every hour we spent observing our assigned entities was preparation for this moment. Every psychological evaluation was assessment of our readiness for transformation. Every containment protocol we developed was training for the day we would become the things we thought we were containing. The age of human noise is ending. The age of perfect silence is beginning, and we are its apostles. I stand up from the bench and continue walking through Haven Springs, my footsteps making no sound on sidewalks that will never echo with voices again. Tomorrow, I'll move on to the next town on my route, following highways that lead toward communities that still believe their words matter. But as I reach the edge of Haven Springs and step back onto the dark highway, something stops me. A sensation I haven't felt since that night in the warehouse. The presence of something else moving through the darkness. Not the Hushborn's influence, but something different. Something wrong. I turn around and look back at the town I've just silenced. The streetlights cast their amber pools across empty sidewalks. The houses glow with warm yellow windows where families continue their lives in perfect quiet. Everything appears normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be. But there's movement in the shadows between buildings. Figures that shouldn't be there, moving with purpose that has nothing to do with my mission. Federal agents. They've found me. I can see them now creeping through the darkness with military precision. Black tactical gear, night vision equipment, weapons designed to contain anomalous entities. They must have been tracking the expanding zones of silence, mapping my progress across the country, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But they don't understand what they're dealing with. They think I'm still human, still vulnerable to conventional weapons and containment procedures. They have no idea that I've become something beyond their ability to capture or control. The lead agent spots me standing on the highway and raises his weapon, some kind of modified rifle equipped with sensors and targeting systems I don't recognize. Behind him, 6 more figures emerge from concealment positions around the town perimeter. "Calder Rourke," the leader shouts, his voice cutting through the night air with jarring loudness after hours of perfect silence. Federal agents, you're under arrest for domestic terrorism and violations of the National Security Act. I want to laugh at the absurdity of it, but laughter requires sound. And I lost that ability months ago. Instead, I simply stand there and watch them advance, their boots crunching on gravel as they spread into a tactical formation designed to prevent my escape. "We know what you've done to these towns," another agent calls out. "We know about the Cellar and the entities that were released. You're going to help us understand how to reverse what's happened." They still think this is something that can be reversed. They still believe that human ingenuity and determination can undo the natural order that's being restored. They have no idea they're witnessing the end of an age, the completion of a cycle that's been in motion for 1,000 years. The silence spreads outward from my position, reaching the agent's perimeter. Their voices cut out mid-sentence as they try to coordinate their attack. Their radio communications fail. Even their weapons stop making the mechanical sounds of loading and targeting. But they continue advancing, relying on hand signals and training to maintain their formation. They're professionals, experienced in dealing with anomalous threats. They've probably studied the Cellar's files, know exactly what kind of entity they think they're facing. They're wrong about everything. The lead agent reaches a position 30 feet away and stops, raising his weapon to aim directly at my chest. Through his night vision scope, he can see me clearly. A middle-aged man in work clothes standing alone on a dark highway. He has no idea he's looking at something that exists partially outside the dimensional framework his instruments are designed to measure. He pulls the trigger. The weapon fires silently, launching what appears to be a containment net made of some kind of metallic mesh. It spreads through the air toward me, crackling with electromagnetic energy designed to disrupt anomalous entities. I don't move. I don't need to. The net passes through me like I'm made of shadow, hitting the asphalt behind me and dissipating into nothing. The agent stares in shock, cycling through different ammunition types as his colleagues close in from multiple angles. Tranquilizer darts, sonic disruptors, even what looks like a miniature harpoon. All of them pass through my position without making contact. The agent's confusion is visible even in the darkness, their tactical coordination breaking down as they encounter something their training never prepared them for. I take a step toward them, then another. My movement is fluid now, no longer constrained by human limitations of balance and momentum. I can feel the Hushborn's true nature asserting itself, the entity's original form bleeding through the human disguise that's no longer necessary. The agents retreat, maintaining their formation but clearly recognizing that their weapons are ineffective. The lead agent speaks into his radio, forgetting that no sound can emerge in my presence. His mouth moves frantically as he tries to call for backup that will never hear his pleas for help. One of the younger agents panics and runs. I watch him sprint toward a black SUV parked on a service road half a mile away, his legs pumping desperately as he tries to escape the expanding zone of silence. He almost reaches the vehicle before the quiet catches up with him. His footsteps disappear first, then his labored breathing. He continues running for another 100 yards in complete silence before he stops, confused by the absence of audio feedback from his own movement. He turns around to look back at his team, and I can see the moment he realizes what's happened. The fear in his eyes is beautiful. The remaining agents form a defensive circle, backs to each other, weapons trained outward even though they know their equipment is useless. They're waiting for something, a helicopter extraction maybe, or reinforcements with specialized gear designed to handle entities like me. They don't understand that no one is coming. The silence has spread too far now, creating a dead zone in all radio frequencies for miles around. Even if backup teams are en route, they'll lose communication as soon as they enter the affected area. I approach the defensive circle slowly, watching the agents track my movement with their weapons. Their training is excellent. They maintain discipline, even in the face of something they can't understand or fight. But I can smell their fear, taste their desperation in the air that no longer carries sound. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with grey streaks in her hair and eyes that have seen too much, makes one final attempt at communication. She drops her weapon and holds up both hands, mouthing words I can read, even though no sound emerges. "We can help you. Whatever was done to you at the cellar, we can fix it. You don't have to do this." She still thinks I'm a victim of some kind of experiment gone wrong. She can't comprehend that I've become exactly what I was always meant to be. That the transformation is the goal, rather than an accident, to be corrected. I reach the edge of their circle and stop. Up close I can see the advanced equipment they're carrying. Devices that detect electromagnetic anomalies. Instruments that measure dimensional stability. Even what appears to be a portable containment unit designed to hold small entities. All of it is useless against something that exists across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. I extend my hand toward the lead agent, not to attack, but to show her what I've become. My fingers are no longer entirely human. They flicker between flesh and the stitched hide that is my true skin. The bones are visible through translucent patches, and my nails have become curved like claws. She stares at the transformation with professional fascination, despite her fear. Even now, facing something beyond her understanding, she's trying to gather data and analyze what she's seeing. Her scientific training won't let her stop observing, even when observation might cost her life. The other agents maintain their defensive positions, but I can see doubt creeping into their movements. They're starting to understand that they're not dealing with a rogue researcher or escaped test subject. They're facing something that was never human to begin with, something that used human form as camouflage while it prepared for its true purpose. I place my transformed hand on the lead agent's shoulder, and she gasps silently as the Hushborn's nature flows into her through direct contact. For a moment she concedes what I see, the world as it truly is, without the acoustic pollution that masks reality's underlying structure. She sees the towns I've silenced not as tragedies, but as improvements. Communities freed from the meaningless noise that distracted them from important truths. People living in harmony with the natural order that existed before humans learned to speak. She sees the 1,000-year cycle playing out across history, the periodic return to silence that allows the world to reset itself. The plagues and curses that weren't supernatural punishments, but natural corrections, restoring balance to a universe that had become too loud. Most importantly, she sees what's coming next, the expansion of the silence beyond rural communities to major cities, the gradual conversion of entire populations to peaceful, quiet existence, the end of human noise and the beginning of something better. When I remove my hand, she staggers backward with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear, but of understanding. She knows now that stopping me isn't just impossible, it's wrong. What I'm doing is necessary, natural, inevitable. The other agents see her reaction, and their discipline finally breaks. 2 of them run, fleeing into the darkness toward vehicles that may or may not still function. One drops his weapon and falls to his knees, overwhelmed by the proximity to something his mind wasn't designed to process. The remaining 3 maintain their positions, but lower their weapons. They're no longer trying to capture or contain me. They're simply waiting to see what I'll do next. I could silence them all right now, expand my influence to encompass their position, take away their voices permanently, and add them to the growing network of quiet communities spreading across the continent. It would be easy, merciful even. They would forget what sound meant and live out their lives in peace. But something stops me. A memory from my human life, when I still believed in the importance of choice and free will. These agents came here to stop what they saw as a threat to humanity. They're brave, dedicated, willing to risk their lives to protect people they've never met. They deserve to understand what they're really protecting people from. I turn away from the agents and walk back towards Haven Springs, leaving them standing in their broken formation on the dark highway. Behind me, I can hear them talking, the first sounds they've been able to make since entering my sphere of influence. Command, this is Team 7. Mission status: compromised. The target is not what we expected. Repeat, the target is not what we expected. Copy that, Team 7. What's your assessment? There's a long pause before the lead agent responds. Command, I'm not sure we should be trying to stop this. I'm not sure we have the right to stop this. Explain, Agent Morrison. Another pause. I think we've been looking at this wrong. The silent zones aren't attacks on human communities. They're corrections, improvements, and I don't think the entity responsible is hostile. I think it's trying to help. Agent Morrison, you're to return to base immediately for psychological evaluation and debriefing. All team members fall back to Extraction Point Alpha. Understood, Command. But for the record, I don't think we're dealing with a threat that needs to be contained. I think we're dealing with something that's trying to save us from ourselves. I smile as I walk back into Haven Springs, though the expression makes no sound. At least one person understands now. One person who might be able to explain to others what's really happening, why the silence is spreading, why it needs to continue. The transformation of the world is accelerating. Each town I silence creates a ripple effect, spreading quiet to neighbouring communities through the simple contact between people who have been changed and those who haven't. The federal agents will return to their base and carry the Hushborn's influence with them, silencing their colleagues and superiors without even realising they're doing it. Within months, entire government agencies will be operating in perfect quiet. Military bases will conduct their operations without sound. Even the highest levels of leadership will find themselves unable to speak, forced to govern through written communication and gesture. And gradually they'll realise that the world works better that way. Without the constant noise of political rhetoric and media commentary, without the meaningless chatter that fills television and radio, people will rediscover the peace that comes from silence. I reach the centre of Haven Springs and sit back down on the bench where I waited earlier. The town sleeps around me in perfect quiet, its residents dreaming dreams that make no sound. Tomorrow they'll wake to a world without voices, and within hours they'll forget that voices ever existed. In the distance, I can sense my fellow graduates continuing their own missions. Dr. Grimm has reached the outskirts of Kansas City, preparing to silence one of the largest metropolitan areas in the central United States. Finn Holloway is working his way through the telecommunications infrastructure, systematically eliminating the electronic noise that connects distant cities. Holden Meyer patrols the borders of our operational area, ensuring that no military response can organize effectively against us. And somewhere in the shadows, other entities from the Cellar pursue their own purposes, bringing darkness to places that have forgotten night, accelerating death where life has become unbalanced, opening doorways to places where reality works differently. We are all servants of the same cause, tools in a vast mechanism designed to restore the natural order that existed before humanity learned to violate the universe's fundamental preference for quiet. The work continues. The age of silence advances, and I am its most devoted prophet, carrying the Hushborn's gift to a world that desperately needs what I have to offer, but doesn't know how to ask for it. Tomorrow, I'll continue toward Clearwater, then Riverside, then a dozen more communities whose names I've never learned, but whose silence I can already hear calling to me across the distance. Each one will be a small victory in a war that humanity doesn't even know is being fought for their benefit. Behind me, The footsteps make no sound at all. But I know they're there. The quiet ones, the transformed ones, the blessed ones who have been freed from the burden of speech. We walk together now, an army of silence, spreading peace across a continent that has forgotten what peace sounds like. The age of human noise is ending. The age of perfect silence has begun. I'm no longer alone.